Hi, good morning everybody. My name is Nathalie Paquet and I will be your webinar moderator today. So welcome to our webinar. Today you will learn how CEN and CENELEC promote the dissemination of CEN and CENELEC standards for their adoption in partner countries and regions. And to guide you through this process, I'm here with my colleague from the International Cooperation Unit, Mr. Hervé Gauthier.
Good morning.
And before we start, can you just put the slides? Thanks. Before we start, I would like to remind you that all the attendants are muted, but of course you still have the possibility to ask all questions you wish, but then using the questions and panel at the right side of your screen during or just after the presentation. We will review the questions and try to answer all the questions at the end of this presentation. And finally, for those of you that are active on the social media, you will see that we have a dedicated tweet now for this type of webinars, which is #1010webinar. Well, now it's time to give you the floor, Hervé, to present the subject of today.
Thank you, Nathalie. So I'm Hervé Gauthier, managing the International Cooperation Unit of CEN and CENELEC. And today, as mentioned by Nathalie, we'll talk about the dissemination of the homegrown CEN and CENELEC standards for adoption in partner countries and regions. In order to do that, we'll cover a certain number of points which are recapped here on this slide. So we'll start indeed with the rationale for this exercise, the why we disseminate homegrown European standards for adoption outside the CEN and CENELEC membership. We'll also cover the applicable policy and principles, how we frame this activity, and we'll go through a certain number of cases and applicable contractual frameworks to guide you in the how-to, if you're interested, for instance, know how to adopt European standards in your country. We have started gathering quite some data about the adoption of European standards around the world, and thanks to this we'll be able to show you some interesting facts and figures about what has been done so far and how it contributes to alignment between different countries. We'll also mention the future perspectives in our work and some upcoming exercises which also will include the revision of our existing main partnership models, which are the guides 12 and 13, respectively covering the affiliate and partner standardization body statuses. So let's start by setting the scene. What we know is that today we are seeing a trade landscape that is evolving. And how is it happening? First, we note the progressive elimination of the traditional barriers to trade, which are the tariffs and quotas. For instance, we see that there has been a lot of progress achieved in multilateral discussions happening under the auspices of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And on top of that, we have seen, and especially recently, a mushrooming of bilateral free trade agreements that complete what is discussed at WTO level. Just as an example, between the years 1948 and 1994, so at the time of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, there had been 124 of such bilateral trade agreements notified by different countries around the world. So 124 agreements in a matter of 50 years. Since then, there has been over 400 notified to the WTO that was created in 1995. So this shows a dramatic increase in the bilateral trade agreements. Also, we see a higher interdependence between national economies. This is a complementary phenomenon, quite normal. It's linked to the increase in the share of trade in relation to any country's GDP. For instance, when we talk about the 28 countries that now compose the EU, in 2004, export was representing 34% of their GDP. A bit less than 10 years later, it's over 40%. It's again a huge increase when we are more and more dependent on international trade. Besides, we also see some concepts that are emerging or getting stronger, like the global value chain concept, which means that the production is more and more decoupled in a number of steps that can be carried out in different places around the world. That creates the need for a common language to help working together. And that role is taken by standards. In that sense, standards are getting an increasing role as trade enablers to create a level playing field for economic operators. What we know is that the adoption and use of identical standards in different countries supports technical alignment, regulatory convergence, and market access. Basically, as a company, it's easier to export your products to a different market if you know that on this market, the same standards that you use at home will allow you to be in compliance with the local regulatory framework and will help you work together with local companies. In that sense, CEN and CENELEC first encourage all their non-European partners to adopt ISO and IEC standards whenever possible. International standards produced by ISO and IEC are the best means to avoid duplication of work for economic operators. Indeed, there are not ISO and IEC standards for everything. So when there is no existing or suitable ISO or IEC deliverable, CEN and CENELEC strongly encourage the adoption of their homegrown standards to foster technical alignment and trade. What do we mean by homegrown ENs or homegrown European standards? Those are the standards that are not identical to any ISO or IEC standard. I want to highlight here that this approach fits within a system. So basically, what happens is that the dissemination of homegrown ENs by CEN and CENELEC fits within their general strategic framework that is represented by the ambitions to 2020. And here you see an image that shows the logic. First, we want to have Europe strongly engaged and to the extent possible leading in ISO and IEC technical work. We also encourage, we emphasize the importance of aligning the CEN and CENELEC standards with ISO and IEC standards. Today we are at 32% of CEN standards that are identical to ISO standards and 72% of CENELEC standards identical to IEC standards. So we walk the talk in Europe. We also run a series of partnership frameworks and projects that support our strategic cooperation and the technical alignment with third countries. Like, indeed, we first want to get aligned via ISO and IEC, but then, as mentioned just below in the next frame, we disseminate homegrown ENs as a complementary tool to foster technical alignment and trade. A complementary exercise is our involvement in the regulatory dialogues and trade negotiations that are led by the European Union with partners countries around the world. In this context, we promote the European standardization model, including the strong commitment to ISO and IEC, but also the national delegation principle and the withdrawal of conflicting standards. Let's look at the policy now. What is governing the way we disseminate CEN and CENELEC publications is the CEN and CENELEC Guide 10. It is easily to find on our common website. You see here a screenshot. So the CEN and CENELEC Guide 10 is covering the policy on the dissemination, sales, and copyright of CEN and CENELEC publications. It's an essential tool both for CEN and CENELEC, but also for their members to know how to get complementary roles in the dissemination of standards. The main principles that are contained in these guides. First, the fact that CEN and CENELEC hold the copyright in all their publications. Then it clearly states also that the sales of standards is to be ensured by the members mainly. CEN and CENELEC, as regional organizations, do not take part in the sales of their standards, which is different in other cases, like in ISO or IEC, which also distribute directly their standards. The CEN CENELEC Management Center, our premises here in Brussels, we are responsible here for the dissemination of the standards, of the European standards, for adoption, for review, in the work of a technical body of a third country national standardization body, for the identical adoption as a national standard, or for the reproduction, or what we call sometimes adoption with deviations. This means when parts of an EN are included in a deliverable of a third country national standards body. Another principle is that basically the unit I have the pleasure to manage is in charge of the coordination of the dissemination of European standards outside the CEN and CENELEC memberships. So you see here a list of existing contractual frameworks. We have the affiliate status, which are countries covered by the European Neighbourhood Policy, from Morocco to Azerbaijan. We also have partner standardization bodies, 3 at the moment, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Australia. And then third countries, which are the other countries that are not that do not have a framework, a partnership framework with CEN and CENELEC. So neither are affiliates nor PSBs, nor do have any kind of formal cooperation agreement or MOU with us. Any request for European standards for adoption should be addressed to the email address that appears on the screen, enadoptions@cencenelec.eu. Here you see what are the existing formal channels to allow the dissemination of European standards for adoption, with different colors. Dark blue represent the affiliate countries of CEN and CENELEC. In green you see the partner standardization bodies, and in light blue you see all those other third countries that have already requested at least once a European standard for review or adoption. Here we come to the heart of the way it works for the different types of partnership frameworks that we have in place. So different rules for different relationships. At the date of today, we have the affiliate status that is framed by the CEN CENELEC Guide 12 that is also available on the CEN CENELEC common website. So in the case for affiliates, the access to CEN and CENELEC deliverables is automatic. They have direct access to the CEN and CENELEC databases of standards, to the full texts. They don't need to sign any kind of separate license agreement to adopt a new European standard. It's part of their affiliate status. They have to inform CCMC, CEN and CENELEC Management Center, about the use they are making of the standards they are downloading from our databases. And for today, they don't need to report on sales of these standards. For the partner standardization bodies, their status first is framed by the CEN CENELEC Guide 13 that you can find on our website. Basically, the partner standardization bodies, those are the countries that are outside of the European neighborhood, can have access to the CEN and CENELEC deliverables for adoption at national level, but they need to request us to provide them with the text of the standard. So they don't have this direct access to the databases. However, they don't need a specific license agreement to adopt identically any CEN or CENELEC European standard. They have to notify, and that's very important, they have to notify us about the status of adoption of the standards they have requested, and also to report on the sales of these standards within or without their country. For all the other standardization bodies that do not enjoy one of these two formal frameworks, there still is the possibility to get European standards for adoption. in that context, they need to address the email address that I indicated earlier, which will be read by my colleague Alexandra Rentea, who is in charge of this activity for CEN and CENELEC. Then they will have to sign a specific license agreement that contains a series of rights and obligations to well frame the adoption of the European standard. They will have to notify on the actual status of adoption and on the sales of that standard. And here we come to a very interesting point. End of last week, we just had the approval of the new versions of the CEN and CENELEC Guides 12 and Guides 13. The new version of these guides are resulting in certain number of evolutions that will affect our affiliates and those who are currently the partner standardization bodies. We have tried via this exercise to streamline a bit the way the dissemination of European standards is ensured, and to make it easier for our partners to better access the European standards for adoption. For the current affiliates, there won't be a lot of changes in terms of rights and obligations. However, for the others, those who are currently partner standardization bodies, and we hope to have many more in the near future, there will be also a direct access to the CEN and CENELEC databases of standards, which was not the case until now. So this will make it far easier for those who will become the companion standardization bodies to get access to European standards for adoption. And they will also have access to a range of IT tools that were previously only available to affiliates in order to adopt European standards. There will indeed be further information in the near future, because these new guides are not published yet. They will be in the coming weeks. For the other national standards bodies or national electrotechnical committees, the rules won't change, but there may soon be a limitation in terms of the number of standards that can be requested for adoption outside of the formal frameworks that are represented by Guides 12 and 13. Let's have a look at the way it works concretely in terms of agreements for the review or adoption of European standards. When there's a need to review a European standard prior to making a decision on whether to adopt it or not at national level, we propose the signature of a copyright declaration. When there's a clear intention to adopt a European standard, be it identical or with some deviations, then we have to sign a license agreement. Let's have a look at the main rights and obligations associated with the review of a European standard. The standard received for review will be protected and watermarked. It can only be circulated to the experts that are involved in the relevant technical body of the third country national standardization body. They will only have access to it for a limited period of time, and after that we'll have to notify their decision confirming whether their intention to adopt the standard at national level or not. They will have to destroy all electronic and paper copies of the European standards received after the end of their review work to protect the intellectual property of CEN and CENELEC. When it comes to the adoption or reproduction, the main rights are about the marketing and distribution of the national adoption on the national territory. Basically, there is no limitation for a standards body that has adopted a European standard to sell it on its territory, but only on its territory. If it distributes it outside the territory, then it will result in the need to pay royalties. And it is anyway strictly forbidden to actively market or publicize the standard outside of the national territory. In terms of obligations, so there is the intended time frame for the actual adoption. So we provide the European standard, but we need to know when it will expectably be adopted at national level. We have also to be informed very precisely when it is actually adopted. And an important principle is that the national standards body that has requested the EN needs to withdraw conflicting standards. So what we ask the NSBs, the national standards bodies that request European standards for adoption, is to play the European game in Europe with withdraw conflicting standards, because we know it is supporting the market, it is supporting our stakeholders. So we ask those who get access to European standards for adoption to do the same on their territory. Then an important case is when there are deviations or modifications, because this is not something that we encourage. We try to limit or to avoid to the possible extent, but still there are some cases when it is justified to introduce differences or modifications in a European standards prior to its adoption at national level. But in that case, the role of the technical body will be essential, and that will be covered a bit later. Here, the workflow, and that's where we will see it more precisely. When we receive a request for a European standard, we first check whether it is eligible and clarify the purpose. Because sometimes we have companies addressing us to get European standards, and we indeed redirect them to our members to buy the standard. So we need to check that the request comes from a national standards body that is member of ISO or IC. Then when we have checked that, we have also clarified whether it is for review. As indicated earlier, if it's for review, we will ask the national standards body to sign a copyright declaration. There is no cost involved. It is free of charge. The national standards body will receive a protected watermark version of the standard and will need to notify the decision to adopt or not after the review process. When it's for identical adoption, it's very simple. There is a need to sign a license agreement, which is quite straightforward. Again, it is a free of charge process. There is no cost associated with the adoption of a European standard at national level in any country of the world. Why? Because it supports the interests of European industry and facilitates market access. It's also a win-win situation, as it helps the economic operators of other countries access the European market. It is free of charge. When it comes to deviations or reproduction requests, it's more complicated. There are different cases. We have to assess the request carefully. We are getting in touch with the technical body concerned that will have to assess a certain number of issues, whether the modifications that are intended to be brought to the standard will create technical barriers to trade, mainly, whether it will still be meaningful in the sense of technical alignment. In some cases, we also consulted a CEN and CENELEC Joint Commercial Advisory Group and liaise with our colleagues in the standards department. If the deviations to be brought to the standards are only minor, for instance, when it's only about adapting to climate conditions or legal constraints that cannot be removed in a way, and in the event that the adoption with deviations will not create technical barriers to trade, then we go back to the license agreement and to a free of charge process. When the deviations are too substantial, when it's a copy-paste of some extracts of the EN, we can sometimes refuse the request. Or, depending on the case and depending on the advice received from the experts that are working in the technical committees, we can allow the adoption, but will require a financial compensation. That's about the process. And now let's look at the results, because I was telling you that we need to get figures about the adoption of European standards outside the CEN and CENELEC membership. What do we see with the figures we receive? We have a clear picture of the level of technical alignment with a big number of countries. On this slide, you see the level of alignment of CEN and CENELEC affiliates and the alignment of their catalog with the catalog of CEN in dark blue and of CENELEC in green. You see the champions like Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, or Serbia that have adopted close to or over 90% of both the CEN and CENELEC catalog. This data can be very useful for economic operators who have a clear picture about the, let's say, friendliness of these markets for to export their product. When we look outside the affiliates community, so outside Europe and its neighborhood, we can see that today there have been already 27 countries that requested homegrown European standards for a review of adoption. In total, there have been 3,802 homegrown European standards requested for adoption or review in countries outside Europe and the neighborhood. And at the date of today, close to 2,000 homegrown standards have been adopted identically outside of Europe. So here in dark blue on the map, you see where these standards have been adopted. And the graph below shows the number of standards that have been adopted, those that are pending adoption, so for which we request to soon receive a notification of adoption, and those in green that are under review. Here you will know it all. All the countries outside the neighborhood of Europe that have requested European standards are appearing on this slide. And you see the number of ENs they have adopted, the number of ENs they have requested for adoption but are still in the process, in the adoption process, and those which are reviewed. A very interesting information here is the sectorial spread of the adoptions. So we see that we have a clear champion sector, which is building and civil engineering, for which close to 1,600 standards have been requested for review or adoption. Interesting also is to see where the standards come from, where most of the requests come from. So the requests for European standards mainly concern these two champions, so the CEN-TC on Eurocodes, logical as it's the one working on construction standards that are in the building and civil engineering portfolio, and on the side of CENELEC, it's the CENELEC TC20 on electric cables. The most popular standards, EN 197-1, which is about cement. For CEN and for CENELEC, we have two standards on electric cables. When we look at the future, what do we have on our plate? We have to implement, or we will have to implement very soon, the revised versions of the CEN-CENELEC Guides 12 and 13. We will have to work on strategies to better address specific challenges. For instance, the dissemination of European standards for adoption by regional standards bodies. This is already the case in the Gulf region. We also want to make more and better use of the information that we have data about the adoption, because we believe it is of high value for our stakeholders. So we want to create more specific targeted information that is sector relevant. And we also want to discuss with ISO and AEC on the possibility for them to centralize data on the adoption of their standards amongst all their members, because this would be very complementary. Imagine, as an industry representative, if you can know what are the ISO standards in your sector that are adopted and where. The same goes for IEC standards. It's a clear trigger and encouragement for market access. So we also already have the information on Europe, and we are looking forward to discussing the possibility to also have ISO and IEC information. Also good to know, it's possible for CEN and CENELEC technical committees to adopt standards from other countries. This is already foreseen by the cooperation we have in place with Russia and Japan. And if not foreseen, we are here to provide support and find solutions. But please note that, of course, this comes after our priority, which is the adoption of ISO and IEC standards. So if interested, just contact us. The key learning points of today's webinar. First, our commitment and preference to have ISO and IEC standards implemented everywhere. As a complementary exercise, when there is no suitable or existing ISO IEC solution, we encourage the identical adoption of the CEN and CENELEC homegrown standards. The applicable rules are available within the guides within the CEN and CENELEC Guide 10, and it is the CEN and CENELEC Management Center that is in charge of this process. There is a possibility to get European standards for review, adoption, or reproduction, which are linked to different contractual frameworks. And our look at the future, revised conditions for affiliates and partner standardization bodies, plus more and better use of the information that we are gathering for the benefit of our stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hervé. I think that the topic is so broad that we have no time for questions now. It's not a problem because I will just leave the line open until I see that nobody is sending in questions anymore. But anyway, we will join you again in September after the summer break. The 1010 webinar will be on the horizontal and cross-sectoral standardization activities. Now, for the presentation, I will send them in the afternoon to the participants. And I just remind you that for the list of question and answer and the video recording of this webinar, everything will be uploaded early next week, on Monday or not Tuesday. Well, thank you very much for having joined us, and see you in September.